One of the first things she told me about him was how he used to belittle her in front of others. There was this one instance where they were at a dinner party with friends and Darlene was sharing a story about something that happened at work. Tom interrupted her in the middle of the story laughing and said, "Oh, Darlene is so important at her job. If she didn't show up, no one would ever get their coffee." Can you imagine how humiliating that must have been for her? And of course he played it off as a joke, but it was clear to everyone that it was meant to hurt. Darlene told me she wanted to disappear right then and there, but the worst part was how he controlled every aspect of her life. He was always paranoid and would accuse her of cheating whenever she talked to another man. Even if it was just the cashier at the grocery store, he'd demand to know who she was calling and where she was going at all times. If she was even a few minutes late coming home, he'd berate her with questions and make her feel guilty as if she was out doing something wrong. There was this one time when her car broke down on the way home from work and she called him to let him know that she'd be late. Instead of offering help or concern, he accused her of lying. And let me tell you, the gaslighting was next level. Darlene would confront him about his behavior and he'd twist it around so that she felt like she was the one in the wrong. He'd say things like "you are too sensitive" or "you are imagining things." There was this one time when she caught him having lunch with another woman and when she confronted him he told her that she was paranoid and insecure even though the evidence was right there. He somehow convinced her that she was overreacting and she ended up apologizing to him. Can you believe that? I think one of the most heartbreaking things she told me was how he'd make her feel worthless whenever she tried to leave. Darlene is a strong woman and she has tried several times to break free from him, but Tom would tear her down saying things like, "You'll never find anyone better than me." Or "No one else will want you after all these years." He had her so convinced that she didn't deserve better and that she stayed over for 15 years believing his lies. I met Darlene when she was still married to Tom. We were both part of this local walking club and honestly that's where it all started. We'd see each other regularly on these walks and over time we just kind of clicked. She was so easy to talk to, one of those people who make you feel comfortable right away. It wasn't long before our friendship grew into something really meaningful for both of us. We'd chat about everything during those walks, from our favorite movies to more personal stuff like our families and the struggles we'd been through, but of course Tom didn't like that one bit. He had this intense jealousy that was pretty obvious from the get-go. At first I didn't really understand why Darlene would go quiet for days at a time. She suddenly stopped responding to my texts or wouldn't show up to our walking group meetings. I was confused and honestly a bit hurt, but I figured she had her reasons. Eventually she told me that Tom had a problem with our friendship. He'd get furious whenever he found out we'd been talking or that she'd been out walking with the group, especially if I was there. He accused her of having feelings for me, which at that point she didn't. We were genuinely just friends, but in Tom's twisted mind any man who showed her attention was a threat. There was this one time I remember clearly. Darlene and I had just finished a walk and we stopped by a cafe to grab a coffee. It was all innocent and we were just chatting about how nice the weather was and making small talk. But apparently someone Tom knew saw us and mentioned it to him later. The next thing I know, Darlene's disappeared off the face of the earth for nearly a month. When she finally resurfaced, she told me that Tom had gone off the rails, accusing her of cheating and demanding that she stop talking to me altogether. He even went as far as to take her car keys. To him, the fact that we enjoyed each other's company was enough to set him off. What really got to me was how she'd apologize every time she pulled away. She'd say things like, "I'm sorry, Jason. I just can't handle the drama at home right now." It was clear that she was trying to avoid conflict, but it broke my heart to see her so trapped. I tried to reassure her, telling her that I'd be there whenever she was ready to come back and that there was no pressure, but it was obvious that the situation with Tom was eating her alive. The more I learned about Tom and his behavior, the more protective I felt over Darlene. She didn't deserve any of it. She was always so kind and considerate, going out of her way to make sure everyone else was okay even when she was dealing with so much. I think that's what made it all the more painful to see her pulled away from things she loved because of Tom's insecurities and control issues. Eventually, after one too many of these incidents, Darlene started to open up more about what life was really like with Tom. She told me about the constant accusations, the belittling comments, and how he'd twist everything to make her feel like she was the one in the wrong. It became clear that this wasn't just about me. Tom was a toxic presence in every aspect of her life. He'd isolate her from friends, criticize her looks, her cooking, her job, everything. He was slowly chipping away at her self-esteem, making her feel like she couldn't do anything right. Leaving Tom was the hardest thing Darlene had ever had to do. After 15 years of putting up with his controlling and abusive behavior, she finally reached her breaking point, and somehow the straw that broke the camel's back was something as simple as oversalting the food. It was just one of those days where nothing seemed to go right. Darlene had been rushing to get dinner on the table after a long day and she accidentally added too much salt to the dish. It wasn't even that bad, honestly. But Tom lost it. He started yelling at her, calling her names, making her feel like she was the worst wife in the world. But this time something inside Darlene just clicked. She didn't argue back, didn't try to defend herself like she usually did. She just sat there quietly taking it all in, and I think that's when she realized she couldn't do it anymore. The next day while Tom was at work, she packed her things and left. She didn't know where else to go, so she came to me for help. And when she showed up at my door, she looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in weeks. I didn't hesitate for a second. I took her in, no questions asked. The next few months were really tough as she went through the divorce process. I've never seen anyone so worn down by life. Darlene was a shell of herself, but she was also determined. She knew she deserved better even if it was hard for her to see it sometimes. Every day was a new challenge. Tom wasn't exactly making the divorce easy. He tried to drag it out as long as possible, probably hoping that she'd change her mind and come back to him, but Darlene stood her ground even though it was tearing her apart. She was dealing with so much at once. Not only was she trying to rebuild her life after leaving Tom, but she also had to navigate her relationship with her daughter Linda, 20 female, who was only 15 at the time. Linda had always been closer to Tom, or at least that's how it seemed. She idolized her dad and couldn't understand why her mom had left him so suddenly. I could see the pain in Darlene's eyes every time Linda would call, crying and asking why she'd broken up the family. Linda felt betrayed, like her mom had abandoned her and their family without any warning. I remember one night Darlene was sitting at my kitchen table, her phone in hand, tears streaming down her face. She had just gotten off the plane with Linda, who had once again begged her to come back home. Linda didn't know the full extent of what had been going on between her parents. How could she? Tom had been careful to keep up appearances in front of her. He was always the doting father when Linda was around. But behind closed doors, he was a different person. My stepdaughter, who always hated me, gave me a birthday card, and I was so touched, until I opened it and read, "I hate you for marrying my mom and I hope you die." As the sole breadwinner of the family, I decided to take action, and now she's begging me to stay in her life because if I leave, she knows she'll be alone forever. Darlene had tried to explain to Linda why she had to leave, but it was hard for a 15-year-old to understand the complexities of an abusive marriage. I did my best to support Darlene through all of this, but I could tell she was struggling. She felt guilty for leaving Linda behind even though she knew it was the right thing to do for her own sanity. The guilt was eating her up inside, and she was worried constantly about how Linda was coping, and it didn't help that Tom was feeding Linda lies, trying to paint Darlene as the villain in all of this. He'd tell her things like, "Your mom doesn't care about us anymore, or she left because she wanted to be with him," which was complete BS. But Linda was young and confused, and she didn't know who to believe. Because of this, Linda always hated me even before I started dating Darlene. It didn't matter that I'd been there for her mom during some of the toughest times of her life. To Linda, I was the guy who came between her parents and ruined everything. So when Darlene and I started dating about a year ago, Linda wasn't exactly thrilled.